Tonight, we turn away from the grand tales of castles and kings and step instead into the overlooked edges of history. This isn't the story that makes it into paintings or chronicles. It's the story of medieval peasants, the people who didn't wear crowns, ride war horses, or leave behind great legacies. They endured plagues, hunger, bitter cold, and endless labor. Their lives were marked not by glory, but by quiet survival, long days, short nights, and a strength most of us today would struggle to endure. If stories like this about ordinary lives in history interest you, feel free to like and subscribe. And share in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. It's always grounding to see people across the world connecting over the same forgotten story. So, settle in, and let's begin at the very edge of the map. Here lies a village without a name, or if it ever had one, time has erased it. It sits in a shallow valley, hidden away in the middle of nowhere. Too distant for roads, records, or the notice of kings. No map would ever mark it, even if you owned one, which you don't. For you, the world ends where the forest begins. The trees are vast, heavy, and ancient, moving slowly like something alive, tolerating your presence but never quite welcoming it. The fields spread out in uneven stretches of green and brown, worked to the point of exhaustion, then worked again the next day. Somewhere far to the north lies a river. You've never laid eyes on it, yet people speak of it in the same hushed way they talk about saints or legends. This is the place you were born, and it's where you'll die. Perhaps no more than 60 paces separate the two. The homes here are bent and weathered, shaped by too many winters pressing against them. Their walls are wattle and daub, mud, straw, and sticks twisted together, patched again and again with whatever scraps the storms haven't stolen. The roofs, made of sagging thatch, slump under their own weight, dripping in corners you can never quite fix. The village carries a familiar smell, damp wool, wood smoke, and earth. Beneath it all lingers the sour edge of livestock and the faint rot of things left too long in the rain. You hardly notice it anymore. To you, it is simply the smell of life here. The road leading in is barely a road at all, only a pair of muddy tracks carved by the slow grind of ox carts. Pools of rainwater gather there, buzzing with mosquitoes. No noble or traveler of importance has set foot on it for years, perhaps ever. Most days pass in silence. Sometimes a bell rings faintly from a distant chapel, its sound drifting on the wind. More often, time is kept by the sun's climb, the lengthening shadows across the fields, or the dull ache that grips your back long before noon. There are perhaps a dozen families in the village, just enough to gather together on feast days. Everyone knows each other, and everyone knows each other's troubles, though they're mostly ignored until they can't be anymore. The closest thing to an elder is a man called Tom, who once held a conversation with a wandering monk and now repeats it as proof of his wisdom. No one questions him. His hut is still standing, his goats still alive. That seems qualification enough for leadership here. Life isn't measured in precision. There are no records, no maps, no deeds, no written claims. Boundaries are remembered by landmarks, past the old elm or where the earth turns soft. When disputes rise, they fade just as quickly, with a brief argument, a shrug, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed hand to hand until the quarrel no longer matters. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. When a stranger does arrive, it's the talk of the village for weeks. Where have they come from? What do they want? Do they carry a curse? Do they smell faintly of salt air? The appearance of an outsider is equal parts fascinating and frightening. And no one here truly leaves. The thought of travel is more rumor than reality. You've heard of towns and cities, with stone buildings stacked 2 or even 3 stories high, but such places feel like fairy tales, alongside stories of talking beasts or women who transform into birds. You can't long for a world you've never seen. Around it all, the forest remains thick, silent, and watchful, hemming the village in like a living wall. The hills roll on endlessly, and the roads, when they exist at all, are remembered more for bandits and misfortune than for leading anywhere worth reaching. And even if you did set out toward those distant places, what then? You don't know their dialects. You have no coin to trade, no sense of their customs. You don't even know your own exact age. So, you stay. There is a kind of safety in the familiar. Even when it's harsh, even when the roof leaks, the well runs shallow, and the same thin stew has been simmering for 3 days. There's comfort in the predictable rhythm, in knowing where the firewood is stacked, who to call when a fence gives way, and which patch of the evening sky tells you it's time to bring in the sheep. Life is simple. You rise with the sun, work until it dips, and rest in the dark. It may not be much, but it is life. And within that quiet rhythm lies a kind of peace, a peace that never demands answers, never looks beyond what can be seen from the crest of the nearest hill. Occasionally, you'll hear a rumor, a war being fought, a king who has died, or a comet streaking across the heavens that frightened a village 5 days' walk away. But such news never arrives whole. By the time it reaches you, it's just a story, worn thin from passing through too many voices, a merchant, a shepherd's cousin, a distant traveler. Its urgency disappears long before it arrives. Even time itself feels different here. The seasons don't turn neatly. They slip and blur, fading into each other with no clear line between one and the next. A damp spring softens into a soggy summer. A sharp frost hardens into a winter that bites straight through your boots. You don't count the years the way others might, you measure life by the harvests. The dry one, the wet one. The bad one, when the rye turned black with rot. The good one, when the barley grew thick and plentiful, and even old Margery managed to smile for a week. Every so often, the steward comes. He asks questions, takes notes, and gathers grain for the Lord. You answer carefully, never saying too much. He doesn't care for detail. You've never seen the king himself, and you don't really know what he does. But you know his name, and you whisper it in your prayers, just in case it holds some weight in the heavens. Here, on the far edge of the map, very little ever changes. And when it does, change usually carries trouble. Still, the hearth glows. The roof mostly keeps out the rain. The cottage holds warmth through the cold. And tomorrow, the same sun will rise above the same hills. For now, that is enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, yet nearly all of them will be in circles. Most people in the medieval countryside never ventured more than a few miles from where they were born. Not because they lacked curiosity, strength, or endurance, though boots were rare luxuries, but because the world beyond the next hill didn't feel like it belonged to them. The thought of chasing it seemed as unlikely as learning to fly. You grew up memorizing the land between your cottage and the edge of the fields. You knew the twist of every tree root on the path to the well. You could recognize neighbors by the depth and shape of their footprints pressed into the muddy road. But anything past that was more rumor than reality. The next village might sit only 5 miles away, yet it could just as easily be a foreign land. You'd hear whispers about it: who married whom, who stole a goat, who swore the priest snored through mass. But you never saw it with your own eyes. And most likely, you never would. Travel was uncertain, often dangerous, and rarely worth the risk. Not dangerous in any adventurous or exciting way, but in the quiet, exhausting, sometimes fatal sense. Roads in the medieval world weren't neat paths with signs or inns waiting at intervals. They were little more than muddy tracks cutting through fields, forests, and long, silent stretches of empty land. There were no maps, no clear directions, just vague instructions like, walk until you see the leaning pine, then turn near the stone shaped like a sleeping pig. And along these paths, there were dangers. First, the forest itself. Medieval forests were not tidy or inviting. They were dense, shadowed, and tangled with roots, filled with sounds you couldn't always name. Wild boars, hungry wolves, and sometimes people who preferred not to be found. If you weren't born into the woods did not welcome you. Second, the threat of bandits. Men and women with no land to farm, nothing to lose, and everything to gain from desperate acts. Travelers made easy prey, especially those who looked even slightly well-fed. A man walking with too much purpose might be assumed to carry coin. A woman traveling alone was often believed to have something worth stealing. You learned quickly that confidence wasn't protection. Third came the danger of being lost. And this wasn't the kind of inconvenience you could fix with patience. If you strayed from the path, no one would come searching. Following a river wouldn't guarantee safety. You might walk for days without seeing another soul. Your body could vanish into the thickets as if it had never existed. People wouldn't even realize you were gone until the next feast day, when someone asked after you and another simply shrugged. Then there were the practical concerns. If you wandered too far, who would care for your field? Who would feed the animals? What if the Lord Steward arrived to collect a tax while you were absent? A man with a ledger doesn't accept curiosity as an excuse. Your duties never paused simply because you wanted to know what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did manage to reach another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders often carried problems with them: disease, crime, or unsettling new ideas. They spoke in slightly different dialects, used unfamiliar turns of phrase, or even held a spoon in a way that marked them as strangers. Such differences could earn suspicion, or worse. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. Food was scarce, beds already filled. The safest place was always home. Not because it was truly safe, but because it was known. You understood which patch of the roof let in rain, which chickens wandered too far, and which neighbor might lend you a tool without too many questions. Beyond the village, no one owed you anything. Still, travel happened from time to time. Rarely by peasants, but by merchants, monks, or messengers, people with protection, a mission, or both. You might glimpse them once or twice a year, passing through with carts stacked with wool or barrels of salted fish, leaving behind fragments of distant stories that lingered like smoke from a dying fire. They told tales of cities where buildings rose from stone, where shops sold bright spices, and where the streets stayed solid instead of dissolving into mud whenever it rained. To you, it sounded more like myth than truth. You listened, but you didn't let yourself imagine too deeply. Because even if such places existed, what would you do there? You couldn't read. You carried no coin. You didn't know the rules or customs expected in such vast places. A city could swallow you whole, and not a single soul would remember your name. So, you stayed. Not out of cowardice, though fear was sometimes there, but because you had responsibilities, a broken fence to repair, a niece to watch over, a bit of barley to dry before the weather shifted, and a dozen other tasks that demanded attention before the sun slid beneath the tree line. And, truthfully, you didn't need the world to be larger than it already was. The village was enough. It carried its share of gossip, quarrels, sudden sickness, and fleeting joys. Life moved with the tolling of bells, the shifting of seasons, and the quiet pride of simply surviving another day. At times, your thoughts wandered to what might lie beyond the dark woods, but most days your concern was simpler, making sure the stew didn't burn while you hauled water. Some people did leave. Usually the desperate, the reckless, or sometimes the ambitious. A young man might set out chasing work, adventure, or a cause he thought worth dying for. He might return with a limp, a tail, or not return at all. And when he didn't, the villagers said little. They just muttered, "He went beyond the trees," as if those words explained everything. Perhaps they did. For those who stayed, life remained small. But it was steady, and more importantly, it was known. You weren't lonely, not exactly. Days were shared with family, with neighbors, with the animals in the yard and the land itself. There was comfort in repetition, in the same old stories and the same old complaints. You didn't need the lights of a distant city to understand the worth of warmth, or the spice of cinnamon to know the joy of sweet bread, or a great journey across kingdoms to taste love, sorrow, boredom, or hope. As the years passed and the ache settled deeper into your bones, and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the dream of travel faded, not with regret, but with quiet understanding. Some people were meant to wander. You were meant to stay. There was no blueprint, no architect's plan, no neat stack of lumber waiting for assembly. Only mud and wood, and whatever the land was willing to spare. Your home was not quite a house in the way others might imagine. It was a truce, between shelter and weather, between effort and decay, between what you asked for and what the ground reluctantly allowed. You began with the frame. Rough-hewn timbers from the nearest trees, cut with tools worn smooth by more hands than you could ever count. The wood never stood straight. It bent. It warped. But you didn't mind. Neither are your walls. Once the frame is up, you leave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts, a process called lee. It isn't elegant. It isn't even quick. But it holds, more or less, like the rest of your life. Then comes the daub. A mixture of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slap it on with your hands, pressing it into the gaps, smoothing it just enough to keep out the wind and pretend it was meant to look that way. It dries slowly, cracking beneath the sun, crumbling in places, always needing repair before the next winter. The smell lingers at first, strong and earthy, but in time it becomes background, unnoticed. The roof is thatch, layer upon layer of dried straw pressed tight, lashed to the beams. When it's new, it shines golden, almost beautiful. Then the rains come. Then the birds. Then time. The gold fades. The edges unravel. Small holes creep in where you never imagined they would. You place buckets under the leaks, shifting them again and again, until it feels like the buckets are part of the house itself. You don't shingle. You don't waterproof. You only patch and repatch until the roof itself feels more patch than roof. And sometimes, late at night, you wonder whether it would be easier to live beneath a cart, where at least the leaks are honest. The floor is nothing but earth. You convince yourself it's firm, and in a way it is. Years of sweeping, spilling, and stomping have packed it down hard. But when rain falls, it softens. When frost comes, it cracks. If the goats crowd inside for the night, you stop wondering what you're actually stepping on. Sometimes you scatter straw or rushes to make it feel cleaner, and it works for a while. But soon the straw turns damp, trampled, ground into dust until it's just part of the floor again. You sweep it out, or you don't. Eventually you accept it, the dirt and the straw merging into one. The windows are little more than openings in the wall, shuttered with rough boards that never quite fit flush. Glass is out of reach, too costly, too fragile, so the wind comes in, the cold comes in, the sounds of animals outside drift in, and on occasion, the animals themselves. There's only one door, usually hanging a bit crooked after the ground shifted in the last frost. It closes with a wooden peg or a bent hook, not to protect anything, since there's nothing worth stealing, but to keep the chickens in and the weather out. Inside, everything is shared. One room, perhaps two if someone had the energy to add a lean-to or loft, but more often just one space where life happens. You cook, eat, sleep, mend, argue, talk, and wait for tomorrow all in the same four walls. Everyone fits under this roof: parents, children, a grandparent, a cousin or two, maybe even a neighbor's child whose own parents are gone or too ill to care for them. At the center of it all sits a hearth, stone if fortune favored you, clay if it didn't. Smoke curls upward through a hole in the roof, no chimney, just an opening that never quite clears the air. Inside, it's always hazy, always warm in patches, damp in others, and always carrying that faint, lingering scent of stew that's been reheated too many times. Furniture is sparse. A table. A bench. Maybe a stool. If someone in your family had skill with wood, or luck in marriage, you might even have a carved chest. Beds are crude wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, noisy when you shift and almost always shared. The blankets are thick wool, itchy, heavy, and never truly dry. Up in the rafters, storage is tucked away, braids of garlic, strings of onions, bundles of herbs, and if the year was kind, a small ham from the pig. The very air above your head changes with the seasons. You can tell winter from spring by the scents drifting down. Sometimes it feels safe. Sometimes it's a warning of how close you are to hunger. And then there are the animals. Not outside, but inside, part of the household as much as anyone else. The cow might sleep in the corner with you. Chickens, too. Maybe a goat. It isn't pleasant, and it certainly isn't clean, but it keeps the place warmer. After a while, the clucking, shuffling, and sudden bleats at night fade into the background, just another layer of sound alongside the whisper of wind through the thatch or the groaning walls as they settle. Nothing sits straight. The floor sags, the roof tilts, the walls puff outward as though the house itself is alive and breathing with the seasons. You mend what you're able. You ignore the rest. Each spring you promise yourself you'll finally shore up the back wall, and every autumn it's still leaning. This isn't a house meant to endure forever, it's a house meant to survive the next storm. Still, despite its flaws, and there are plenty, you know it as home. You've learned the cracks and quirks. You know how to stuff an old sack into the draft that sneaks through the door. You know which roof beam can bear a hanging pot and which one groans dangerously if leaned on. You know how the afternoon sun slants through the gaps in the walls and the exact spot where the dog curls up to sleep. Outsiders see only hardship. You see persistence, recycling, care. A roof still holding is a kind of triumph. A fire still glowing in the morning is a gift. A patch of floor that stays dry after rain is wealth. And when night falls, and you lie down amid the smoke, straw, snores, and silence, there's a strange comfort in it. Not pride, exactly, more like belonging. This is your place. It bends, it leaks, it sways in the wind. But it endures. And so do you. For the average peasant, food was never about pleasure. It wasn't colorful, varied, or even reliably hot. It was a problem, one that returned day after day, solved with the same few scraps and the same thin hope that something edible could be coaxed from them. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was little more than the space by the hearth in the single-room home. There was no stocked pantry, no neat rows of spices, no sunlit shelves filled with herbs. Just a single pot, a fire, and the hope that yesterday's scraps hadn't spoiled. At the heart of almost every meal was pottage, a never-ending stew that lingered in the pot, always cooking, never quite finished. It was neither new nor gone, just constantly renewed. You tossed in whatever you had during the day, scooped from it at night, kept it simmering through the months, and hoped nothing unpleasant decided to grow in it while you weren't looking. The ingredients depended entirely on fortune. On better days, you might have cabbage, leeks, barley, and some beans. Maybe a bit of garlic or onion if the garden had been generous. In winter, dried peas and beans stood in. And if you were blessed with real luck, a shred of salted pork could flavor the pot, though more often than not, it was just the bare bone, prized for every ounce of taste it could give. A single bone could be stretched for days, boiled again and again in the hope it still carried a memory of meat. The taste was always the same, plain, heavy, more warmth and flavor. Pottage wasn't eaten for pleasure, it was eaten because there was nothing else. Having a hot bowl at the end of the day wasn't a feast, it was survival, a quiet triumph. The pot itself was never truly clean. It might be wiped or scraped, but rarely scrubbed. Each new stew carried the echoes of the last, the flavor of meals gone by lingering in the iron. There were no spices to hide it, no vinegar to lift it, only the steady, muted taste of survival, like history boiled into broth. Alongside it came bread, the other staple. Not light or golden, but thick, dark, and heavy. It was usually baked from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the fine, white grain, was reserved for the wealthy. Most peasants could barely afford to glimpse it, let alone bake with it. Their loaves were small, weighty, and filling, built more to last than to please. The loaves hardly rose, and they crumbled easily. Leave one sitting for a day and it might serve better as a weapon than a meal. Still, they filled the belly and made a good sponge for stew. At times, bread was made from whatever could be scrounged, husks, weeds, ground peas, or the dusty scraps swept from the miller's floor. In harsher seasons, people even turned to trees. They stripped the inner bark, ground it down, and mixed it with scant flour to bake what was grimly known as famine bread, dense, bitter, and barely fit to eat, but it kept people alive, in the strictest sense. When flour itself ran out, meals turned to trenchers, stale bread used as makeshift plates. These slabs soaked up broth and grease, and when the eating was done, they were consumed, handed down to someone poorer, or tossed to animals. Even at the table, bread revealed its own quiet ladder of class. As for protein, it was scarce, precious. Chickens were kept for their eggs, cows for their milk. To slaughter an animal was a last resort, and when it happened, nothing went to waste. Meat, fat, organs, and bones all found use. Even the blood was saved, turned into puddings to stretch a meal further. Every part of an animal was put to use. Fat was melted down, head simmered into broth, nothing went to waste. Pork was the meat most often eaten, when it could be had. Pigs were practical, and their salted fat could transform a bleak, tasteless meal into something at least somewhat enjoyable. Still, a pig wasn't killed lightly. Slaughtering one meant weeks of work, salting, curing, boiling, smoking, and storing, to stretch the meat as long as possible. Fishing offered another source of food, but only for those with access. Many rivers and ponds belonged to lords, and casting a line without permission could cost you dearly. When fishing was possible, people caught eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't spoil instantly. Salted herring, rare and precious, was considered a real treasure. The church also had a heavy hand in what ended up on the table. Fridays and the entire season of Lent banned meat entirely, pushing people toward fish, or toward empty stomachs. In a curious twist of theology, even beaver tails were declared fish, a convenient loophole that gave the hungry one more option. Milk was a regular part of life, but it spoiled fast. You either drank it quickly or turned it into butter or cheese. Butter itself was a rare treat in many homes, used carefully and sparingly. Cheese, by contrast, was sturdier, sharper in taste, often dry, and capable of lasting longer. A household with several rounds of cheese stacked away was considered fortunate. It meant their cow had given well that year. Still, dairy wasn't perfect. Not everyone's stomach tolerated it, and with no way to refrigerate, it often soured or spoiled. Sour milk was still used, butter turned rancid, and cheese collected mold. People simply trimmed the bad parts and carried on, trusting their bodies to endure more than their food safety standards. As for drinks, choices were limited. Water couldn't always be trusted, it was often dirty or dangerous, depending on the season or the habits of whoever lived upstream. So ale became the standard. Weak ale, or small beer, was brewed at home and drunk daily by all, even children. It had just enough alcohol to make it safer than water and to take the edge off thirst. In luckier places, apples or pears could be pressed into cider. Wine, however, was almost entirely reserved for priests and nobles. Mead was uncommon, more rumor than reality for most households. Milk, when not given to children or the sick, was seldom part of the daily table. For everyone else, the routine was ale in the morning, ale at midday, and more ale in the evening to soften the repetition of life. Vegetables carried most of the diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, and leeks filled the pots. Carrots existed, but not the bright orange kind we know today. Back then they were pale or deep purple. Nearly all of these were grown in small plots beside homes, carefully tended and eaten in their entirety. Nothing was wasted. Turnip tops might be boiled for greens, and peels found their way into compost heaps or hearth fires. Fruit was a treat, tied strictly to the seasons. Apples were most common, with berries or the occasional wild plum gathered when luck allowed. Fresh fruit had to be eaten quickly unless dried, which let it last through the cold months. Preservation was always a challenge. Sugar was far beyond the reach of most households, a luxury for the wealthy. Honey, if a family kept bees, was cherished like gold and used sparingly. Without it, the ever-present pottage remained plain, flavored only with what herbs could be coaxed from a garden. Parsley, sage, dill, and mint grew in gardens, but not mainly for taste. Herbs were valued more for healing and custom than for cooking. Some were believed to ward off sickness, others kept insects at bay. If they happened to make food taste better, it was almost by accident. Daily meals were simple affairs, eaten together on benches by the hearth. There were no courses, no written recipes, just a single pot on the fire, a loaf of bread to share, and the quiet hope that something would still remain for tomorrow. Complaining about thin stew didn't fill bowls any faster. On rare days of celebration, weddings, harvest festivals, or the feast of a saint, a family might roast a bird or serve a pie. But don't picture the golden, flaky crusts of today. A medieval pie was more a sturdy shell of dough, built to hold in meat and keep it from spoiling. Spices, if they appeared at all, were treasured luxuries. A bit of pepper, ginger, or cinnamon meant that someone had traded wisely or traveled far. Most days, though, were not feast days. Most days passed quietly. You scraped the bottom of your bowl, softened the last bit of bread in the stew, and washed it down with ale. It was enough to carry you into the evening, though not always enough to feel truly satisfied. Still, there was a kind of comfort in the routine, the familiar taste of the pot, the steady count of how much bread remained, the same hands tending the same fire night after night. Outside, the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, animals stirred in their sleep, and inside, the stew bubbled, the bread cooled, and once again you had just enough. As a medieval peasant, possessions were few. Perhaps a small plot of land to till, a couple of tools, some livestock, and a rough house you pieced together yourself. Yet, none of it was really yours. All of it, land, animals, and in many ways even you, belonged to the local lord. Not a faraway king or storybook ruler, but the man on the hill, living in a house slightly straighter than yours, eating food slightly richer, beneath a roof that didn't always leak. He held ownership of the land, and by extension, everything on it. People like you were called villains. Not an insult, but a legal category, a reminder that you lived under his claim. You tilled the land, but you didn't own it. The soil belonged to the Lord, and so did much of your time. Leaving wasn't an option without permission, nor could you pass the land to someone else freely. Your obligations were clear: labor, goods, and respect. You weren't a slave, yet freedom was limited. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't based on conversation or consent, it was measured in duty. Direct contact with him was rare. Instead, you dealt with the steward, the man who oversaw the estate and kept meticulous records of what everyone owed. And you owed a great deal. Labor came first. On certain days of the week, and often more during the busy harvest, you were expected to work the Lord's fields instead of your own. This service, known as corvée labor, earned you no pay. It was simply part of what you owed for the right to live and farm on his land. No wages, no gratitude, just the understanding that somewhere in the manor house, someone ate because of the work you did. Taxes came in many forms. A share of your grain, a portion of your wool, a chicken here, a few eggs there. Brew ale, and a portion went to the Lord. Own a pig, and he claimed some of the bacon. Caught fish. The river belonged to him. Obligations weren't limited to food. Using the Lord's mill meant paying a fee, even though it was the only way to grind grain properly. Trying to grind it by hand without permission could land you in trouble, sometimes with fines, sometimes worse. Control mattered as much as the share itself. The same applied to the communal oven. Bake at home without authorization, and the steward might reprimand you. Life taught you to follow the rules, even when they were slower, costlier, and seemingly pointless. Fees extended beyond daily necessities. Want to marry? Pay. Want to inherit your father's plot of land? Pay again. Everything came with a price, not always in money, but in labor, compliance, and constant awareness of the Lord's reach. There was always a cost. Want to move to a different village? First, you had to ask permission. Then, naturally, you had to pay a fee. Livestock could be taxed. Tools might be taxed. Even your right to breed animals without asking first was closely watched. Barely anything escaped the Lord's claims. And what did all this give you? In theory, protection. If bandits raided or a rival lord invaded, he had men at arms to defend the land. In famine, he might release grain from his stores, though rarely without charge. If a dispute arose, like a neighbor's goat trampling your garden, his court could adjudicate, again usually for a price. This was feudalism, a system of duties and hierarchy framed in the language of loyalty and protection. But in practice, it was ownership. The land ruled everything. Those who controlled it held the power. Those who worked the land answered to the Lord. The manor itself stood apart from the village, often on higher ground. It might be built of stone or timber, far larger than any peasant home, with a roof so thickly thatched that wind dared not enter. Inside were tapestries, tables, servants, and the Lord himself, clad in wool lined with fur, eating meals you could hardly imagine, and giving you little thought. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you owed this year, how many eggs you promised, whether your son had grown old enough to join the labor rolls. All of it was carefully recorded, not by you, since you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, or the bailiff, carrying wax tablets or bits of parchment and asking questions you had learned to answer cautiously. Failed to meet your obligations, and there were consequences, fines, additional goods demanded, extra days of labor. In extreme cases, your tools could be seized, your land reclaimed, even your home, your goats, your dignity, all could be taken. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion, it was recklessness. Yet strangely, the system endured. Not because it was just, but because it was steady. The rules were clear, harsh but predictable. You knew what you owed and what was expected. No surprises, no sudden shifts, just the relentless rhythm of give, give, give. Occasionally, the Lord might give back something in return, a feast where food was shared, a holiday free of labor, or a passing kind word from horseback. Not enough to equal what you gave, but enough to prevent the balance from collapsing. The relationship was never one of friendship, but it lasted. Your Lord could be young or old, generous or harsh, present or absent, but always above you. You didn't question it. You bowed when he rode by, removed your cap, spoke the proper words, not because he earned them, but to avoid trouble. And perhaps, deep down, a small part of you still hoped that one day, however slightly, you might be seen, rewarded, or lifted. It almost never happened. Yet that faint glimmer of hope kept the system alive, not just fear, but the idea that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, and prayed loud enough, something might change. Meanwhile, the steward walked his rounds, the reeve recorded every detail, the mill ground the grain, and you sank your hands into the soil year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no reward, no chance to rise above your place, only the quiet assurance that you had fulfilled your role. You had done what was asked, survived another year under the weight of someone else's title, and as long as the Lord was satisfied, you were allowed to continue living. Long before the Black Death etched its horrors into history, medieval peasants were already familiar with sickness. Not just the seasonal illnesses that came and went, but the slow, constant shadow of disease, infections, fevers, wasting, swelling, and persistent coughs, always lurking, always threatening. Disease wasn't an occasional disaster, it was part of everyday life. You didn't need a sweeping epidemic to be struck down. Sometimes a small cut, a single flea, or a sip of water that seemed clean was enough. Unlike taxes or the weather, illness didn't follow rules. It arrived unexpectedly and often refused to leave quietly. There were no real hospitals. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman or a midwife who knew which herbs to boil or burn. If you were extremely fortunate, a nearby monk might offer some guidance, literate and well-meaning, slightly more effective than mere prayer. But for most people, sickness meant staying home, lying in bed, sweating through your clothes, and hoping for recovery. Few truly understood what caused disease. The concept of germs didn't exist, and microscopes were centuries away. What people had were theories, ancient, confusing, and often wrong. Some believed disease traveled through bad air, miasma, carried by smells. If the village stank of rot, manure, or smoke, it was considered dangerous, which was true in a way, but not for the reasons they thought. To protect themselves, people stuffed herbs into their clothing, carried flowers in their sleeves, or pressed vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces. Unpleasant, mostly ineffective, but deeply believed. Others saw illness as divine punishment. Sickness came from sin, impure thoughts, disobedience, or moral decay. A sick child was a test. Failed crops followed by illness. Clearly the fault of you, your neighbors, or both. Local traditions offered other explanations: the evil eye, phases of the moon, spirits of animals, or irritated saints. One particularly widespread belief held that disease could enter the body through the soles of the feet. The remedies were as bizarre as the causes. Boiling, burning, or even sacrificing nearby objects, sometimes your mattress, was considered a solution. For fevers, a local healer might show up armed with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than skill. Leeches or sharp stones were occasionally used, all in the name of balancing the humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Though unseen, these humors were blamed for nearly every ailment. For swelling, poultices made from mashed herbs, mud, or bread wrapped in cloth were applied. Some helped, most didn't, and a few made things worse. Stomachaches might be treated by chewing charcoal. Coughing up blood could lead to drinking wine mixed with crushed pearls. Blurred vision might bring whispered prayers with smoke blown over your head. A blackened leg often meant the end of options. Amulets against plague, bits of metal or bone, sometimes inscribed or blessed, were worn around the neck. Onions were buried in house corners, garlic hung above doors. Protection came in strange, sometimes useless forms, but at least something was being done. One common cure involved tying a live chicken to the affected part of the body, hoping the illness would transfer to the bird. It almost never worked, but in a world where hope was scarce, people grasped at anything. Sickness was isolating, though not like modern quarantine. You didn't summon help, you worked until your body refused. When that point came, you lay down while life continued around you. Children still needed feeding, animals still needed tending, and you might be offered a bit of broth and a few whispered prayers. Sometimes, the fever broke, the swelling faded, and you rose again with a cautious step, a new limp, and a deeper appreciation for a hot meal. Other times, it didn't end well, and a candle was lit for you. Plague, in its broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic catastrophe with carts of bodies. Often, it crept slowly, darkened skin, swollen limbs, rattling coughs, smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even the flu, which could incapacitate half a village. There were no statistics, no charts, only stories passed along, a traveler's warning of a cough spreading from another village, or word of children lost near the river. People listened. Water was boiled more carefully. Herbs were left by doorways. Distance was maintained, even if no one explained why. Death was not always a terror, but it was understood. People could sense its approach, slowing breaths, cooling skin, dulling eyes. Soft prayers were murmured by firelight for those near the end. When the Black Death finally struck in the 14th century, its fury eclipsed anything before. Yet by then, illness was already a familiar part of life. The concept of waking well in the morning and gone by night was known, it just became far more frequent. The plague returned in waves, each stronger than the last, bringing strange swellings in the neck and groin, fevers that stole the mind, and blood that darkened and bubbled. Death claimed people in days, sometimes hours. Whole villages disappeared. Fields lay untended as bells tolled too often. Some peasants tried to run, but disease moved faster than their feet. Others sought refuge in faith, doubling prayers, punishing themselves, promising better lives if spared. Some lashed out in anger, blaming outsiders, sinners, or anyone but the invisible wind. The church provided explanations, solace, and burial rites, yet monks and priests often perished too. In places, death became so commonplace that funerals were abandoned, bodies consigned to mass graves without names. Still, life persisted. People adapted, learning to live alongside sickness as they did with hunger or cold, not cheerfully, but with weary resilience. Homes were cleaned more often, herbs were shared, and routines adjusted to survive the relentless presence of death. People whispered new prayers. Some believed that surviving one illness gave them protection against the next. Others didn't believe in such things, but they carried on anyway, milking the cows, tending the fields, keeping life moving. Children learned early which plants were safe, which were poisonous, and which could be boiled until they no longer smelled foul. They learned how to dress wounds, wait out fevers, and recognize when someone was beyond help, knowing when to let go of hope. Through all of this, life did not stop. People married, harvested, and shared the meals they had. They gathered by the fire to tell stories, about the last sickness, or the time a grandfather survived a harsh winter fever with only garlic water and sheer stubbornness. Plague was not the end of life, it was simply another part of it. For those who endured, survival became a quiet form of resistance, a steady, determined refusal to vanish without a trace. A belief that tomorrow would arrive, and if it didn't, someone would remember you, or at least the way you always added rosemary to the pot. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't truly calm. It had a silence like that of a cave, full of subtle creaks, distant noises, and an emptiness that made you acutely aware of your own movements and breath. The day ended when the light faded, and anything that wasn't already secured had to be handled quickly, because after darkness fell, the world contracted to the size of your home. There was no artificial lighting, and candles were too precious to burn freely. If you had a tallow lamp, it was saved for emergencies or prayer. Most nights, only the fire's fading glow marked the passage of time. Sleep came differently than we experience it today. People slept in two stages, a first sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, and then a second sleep. This pattern wasn't random, it was how people adjusted to the long, dark hours between dusk and dawn. You would fall into your first sleep shortly after night had set in. The fire was banked, the animals settled, and the children hushed. The home, usually one room, sometimes two, lay in quiet stillness. If you had a mattress, it was filled with straw or feathers, often lumpy and typically shared. Without one, you slept on woven rushes or bare earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together, family, relatives, even servants, not out of closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only warm space in the house. On the coldest nights, animals joined in, a goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens tucked in a basket. Warmth mattered more than boundaries. Privacy was rare, and sleeping alone was seen as a punishment rather than a comfort. The wealthy might enjoy solitude, everyone else adapted. You faced the wall, stuffed straw in your ears, and shared blankets. You shared each other's warmth and breath, and you grew accustomed to snoring, which someone always did. The first sleep lasted a few hours, then, almost like clockwork, people awoke. It wasn't unsettling, it was normal. Around midnight, the household was quiet and still. Some prayed, others stoked the coals, some used the chamber pot or stepped into the freezing night air. Some reflected silently, some whispered softly. Dreams were vivid during this period. People believed this midnight hour created a thin barrier between the living and the dead, the sacred and the everyday. Dreams in this time were remembered and discussed the next morning as meaningful, not casually. Eventually, the second sleep arrived, deeper, slower, restorative if you were fortunate. It eased aches, cooled blisters, and allowed the body some repair. If luck wasn't on your side, you lay still until dawn offered an excuse to rise. The house never became completely silent at night. The fire popped and crackled, while the wind murmured through the thatched roof. A baby might cry, a cow shuffle its hooves. Occasionally, the night was punctuated by harsh, rattling coughs that seemed endless. Everyone noticed, yet no one spoke, it was understood. Fear of the dark was real and reasonable. The night held genuine dangers, wolves, for example, whose howls sometimes drifted close enough to the village to make your skin crawl. They were real, not merely legends, and they were hungry. Then there were thieves, strangers, accidental fires from stray coals, roofs sagging under snow, and things harder to explain, ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. These were not discussed openly, but everyone knew they existed. To protect the home, People followed rituals, placing iron by the door, making the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispering blessings over the straw mattress, hanging herbs like rosemary, sage, and rue over entrances. Sometimes a string was tied around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with all the protections, many families felt that sleep made you vulnerable, that your soul might drift while your body rested. People were careful when settling down, mirrors were covered, beds faced the fire, and feet were never pointed toward the door. The cold was another adversary, slipping through walls, thatch, and poorly sealed doors. Beds weren't piled with blankets, instead, layers of wool, fur, cloaks, and tunics kept people warm. Sleeping undressed was unthinkable, you stayed in your clothes, sometimes even your boots. There was comfort in sharing a bed, but also constant disturbances. Someone shifted, murmured, bumped an elbow or knee, or the family dog stirred unexpectedly. And yet, all of this was considered normal. Silence wasn't expected, closeness was. In that closeness, there was an odd sense of security. You could hear your father's breathing, your child shifting, your grandmother murmuring prayers in her sleep. It wasn't calm, but it was deeply human, shared with others. Dreams carried meaning, a wheat field might signal prosperity, a snake could signal illness, a broken tooth might foretell death. People learned to read these signs or sought out those in the village who could. The church had its own warnings, claiming some dreams came from the devil and that nighttime was a moment when temptation could creep in. You were advised to pray before sleeping, to keep your soul ready, because some nights were final, illness could strike while you rested, and people sometimes went to bed and never woke. A fever might flare up. A cough could worsen. By morning, someone might have quietly passed, as if taken without a sound. This uncertainty made each morning feel slightly solemn. When daylight returned, the rooster crowed, and the fire was rekindled. It was a sign that you had survived another night. You rose slowly, every joint reminding you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold nipped at your nose. You wiped your face, surveyed the room, and counted the living. Those who stirred were noted, those who didn't were checked. Once the living were accounted for, the day began, fetching water, preparing bread, feeding animals. If your dream had significance, it was shared, and the memory of the night faded, not gone, just softened and folded into the flow of time. In winter, people went to bed early and slept long. In summer, the nights were shorter, but the pattern stayed the same: first sleep, a waking period, then second sleep. There were no clocks, yet life had its own steady routine. Despite the discomfort, the rhythm was grounding and honest. Survival, not comfort, was the goal. If along the way you found a quiet night, a warm moment, or a dream that didn't terrify you, it was a rare gift, unexpected and unclaimed. Some years brought simple hunger, manageable and rule-bound, something you could ration and stretch. Other years brought famine. Famine ignored rules. It struck when fields failed, when markets were empty, and when hope that tomorrow might be better became impossible. Food turned into an idea, not a certainty. In a medieval village, the signs often appeared in spring: too much rain, too little, and the trouble quietly began. The barley sprouted unevenly. The beans bloomed only to wither. The cabbages split too soon. The wheat heads remained small and bowed, as if already grieving. Everyone noticed, even if no one spoke at first. Quiet glances were exchanged. Silent calculations ran through every mind: how much of last year's stores remain? How much seed can we spare? How much can we actually eat? The answers were never comforting. The hardest decisions came in summer, not winter, when you had to choose between planting seeds or using them for flour. Between reserving supplies for a harvest that might never arrive or giving your child one more warm meal. And so the rations shrank. The stew became watery. The loaves grew smaller. Bowls returned less full. The meals returned thinner, less frequent. Panic hadn't set in, at least, not yet. You reminded yourself that shortages had happened before, that nearby villages might have surplus, or that the manor's reserves could cover some gaps. Hope lingered, fragile but present. By August, it was harder to ignore. By September, it was impossible. Animals were no longer fed first. Chickens stayed quiet. Goats grew hollow. If you had a dog, it trailed you silently, as if it sensed its fate. Bread became a ceremony. One loaf was divided 5 ways. Everyone chewed deliberately. Even the smallest crumbs were gathered with care. The stew was mostly water now. Any color came from the pot itself. You boiled weeds, crushed roots, pulled up strange plants and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some were safe. Nights were restless, not from fear, but because hunger gnawed relentlessly. Children stopped asking questions. That's when you realized the famine was real. Children didn't ask when bread would come, or for honey, or even for stories. They simply sat close to the fire, quietly watching, learning patience. Neighbors disappeared from the streets. The village grew still. Laughter vanished from the lanes. Disputes over sheep stopped. All that remained were the occasional coughs or the snap of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel, it made them silent. Occasionally, someone brought back a rabbit, a bird, or a handful of acorns to soak and grind. You ate them, even if bitter, and smiled, not because they tasted good, but because they were something. You tried not to hold resentment toward the manor. Sometimes it provided grain, sometimes it didn't. The steward's visits became rarer. It was a mix of relief and despair. Relief because the Lord wasn't there to take anything. Despair because he wasn't there to offer any help. His absence spoke louder than any words could. The church did what it could, handing out bread after Mass, offering aid to the poorest, but even it was stretched thin. You prayed more often, not necessarily from faith, but because it was something to do when your hands were too worn out to act. Some people left the village entirely, wandering off in search of work, food, or God. Some returned, some never did. No one asked questions, everyone was too exhausted. Famine changes your body. You feel your ribs first, not from the outside, but as if they press too close against your skin. You move slower, bruise easier, wake with clenched hands as if still gripping tools you can no longer use. The cold bites deeper, and the fire becomes your closest companion. By now, most of your time is spent tending the fire rather than cooking. You sit close to it, sleep facing it, and keep it fed even when your own stomach is empty, because warmth is the last luxury you can control. You've eaten everything edible, the roots, weeds, dried beans, stale flour. Bones have been boiled multiple times. Bark has been soaked. Famine bread has cracked your teeth. When even that ran out, you turned to things that weren't really food but might pass for it if desperate enough. You boiled and salted a hare, not tasty, barely satisfying, but chewable. Once, you caught a rat. You didn't scream. You thanked God, cooked it in secret, and told no one. Guilt lingered, but there was no regret. Your dreams start to warp. You dream of feasts, tables overflowing with roasted meat, bread, and wine. You wake chewing your tongue. You dream of boiling food repeatedly, even though it's been days since anything has simmered. Your dreams shift, animals returning, green shoots pushing through the snow, memories of childhood when hunger was simpler. Some nights, you even dream of being full, and you wake crying. The graveyard grew gradually at first, then rapidly, then so fast it was impossible to keep pace. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't toll, there weren't enough hands to ring it. Graves were shallow, prayers brief, mourning quiet. Everyone was too consumed with their own hunger to grieve openly. You wanted to mourn, but had to hold it in, like everything else. Then, as all famines eventually do, it passed, not suddenly, but slowly. Rain returned, the soil softened, seeds sprouted, plants grew, fragile but alive. You found enough strength to hope again. The first harvest was shared carefully, children first, elders next. You took the smallest portion, smiling as you passed it along. When the first good loaf came from the oven, cracked on top, dark beneath, you stared at it before eating. You remembered every empty day, every trick and lie you'd used to protect others. You ate slowly this time, and for the first time in a long while, it truly nourished you. By the time you could walk, the church had already claimed you. At baptism, it recorded your name, blessed your breath with Latin you couldn't understand, and wove your soul into a system that reached far beyond your village. You belonged to it not by choice, but because there was no other path. In the quiet moments of your life, those cold mornings by the fire, those rainy nights when wind rattled the shutters, you felt its presence like gravity. It wasn't merely alongside your life, it shaped it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, and mapped out what lay ahead. The church wasn't just a building to visit, it was the air you breathed, the road you walked, the rhythm of the seasons. Its voice whispered over your grave long before you arrived. The village priest, often the only literate person around, was more than a confessor. He was your calendar, your counselor, and the closest thing you had to an oracle. He carried the knowledge of the heavens, the stories of saints, and explanations for why a pig might die or a storm might strike. He moved through the village cloaked in both blessing and threat. You brought your sins to him quietly, hoping he wouldn't show disappointment. You tried not to dwell on what the priest knew about you. He was present at the milestones of life, birth, marriage, death, the only events a peasant could count on. In between, he spoke on behalf of a God you feared more than you loved, for love, you had been told, demanded obedience. Latin filled the air during Mass, but it might as well have been an incomprehensible spell. You stood in church with your family, feet frozen, hearing words that were not yours, yet feeling their weight. You didn't understand what he said when raising the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something unseen was happening, that the bread had become more than bread, the wine more than wine, and that the gestures and murmured words could reach the divine. You didn't speak them yourself, yet they passed through you. You mouthed along where possible, crossed yourself when others did, and absorbed the rhythm of holiness the way one learns the path to a well, without knowing every detail, but knowing it was necessary. The church dictated when to fast, when to celebrate, dividing the year into sacred moments: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't mark time by months like March or April. You counted it by religious events: after Easter, near St. Michael's. The Church dictated not just when you prayed, but when you ate, what you ate, and how guilty you should feel for enjoying it. 40 days of meatless fasting before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it could make you lightheaded. Fish on Fridays, even if you lived far from any river or sea. Almond milk for the wealthy, turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saints' days, you shared whatever you had. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't have. Even with an empty bowl, your plate was full of rules. The calendar wasn't only about devotion, it was about dues. The Church claimed a tenth of your harvest, no matter the season: grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. Anything produced by your hands or your land had a cost. You gave it because it was said to be God's share. But God didn't collect it, the priest did, or the steward, with his ledgers and quiet nods. You watched your finest barley carted away to the tithe barn, which always loomed larger than your own home. You saw your neighbors give up their last sack of oats while the priest prayed for mercy on the offerings they had just paid. When the harvest failed, rains too late, frost too early, the demands didn't change. You still owed what you owed. Sometimes you were allowed to pay with candles or labor, sometimes you weren't. Occasionally, the burden grew so heavy it bent your back even when you stood upright. Yet the Church didn't only take. It also gave, though not always in the ways you desired. It offered stories, structure, and explanations. When your cow died mysteriously, the priest instructed you on which saint to petition. When your child fell ill, he suggested it might be a test, a punishment, or the devil finding a crack in your faith. He gave blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle, or advised a visit to a shrine. Occasionally, the priest would give you a tiny relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in the blood of some long-forgotten martyr. You treated it like a treasure. Sometimes it seemed to help, sometimes it didn't, but even when it failed, it was better than nothing. There were saints for every need: Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for plowing, Saint Sebastian for the plague. You didn't know when or where they had lived, only their names and what they could supposedly fix. Their stories were part memory, part magic, passed down by firelight from people who couldn't tell where fact ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else, whispering their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made bargains, promising bread, fasting, or a pilgrimage if they would help this one time. Sometimes they appeared to answer, or at least seemed to, and that was enough to try again. Pilgrimages were holy journeys, yes, but also rare chances to step beyond the same 5-mile radius you'd known your whole life. You traveled unfamiliar roads, heading toward shrines you'd only ever heard about. Your prayers went with you, tied to your back or clutched tightly in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived weary, standing before a relic or statue, hoping for some shift inside yourself. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't, but you returned not necessarily healed, just changed, or at least tired enough to feel you had been. Even death followed the Church's rituals. When it neared, you summoned the priest. He came with oil and prayers, touching your forehead, speaking words meant to guide your soul onward. Your family gathered, candles were lit, and the bell might toll if anyone had the strength. You were laid to rest on consecrated ground, among others who had walked the same journey. Then came the masses, more candles, more prayers, paid for in hope that the priest would remember your name in his chants. Even in death, debts persisted. The Church taught that your soul might not reach heaven immediately. It could linger in purgatory, a dim corridor between torment and salvation. You might remain there for years, centuries, or even longer, unless someone intervened. Unless family or friends prayed, lit candles, gave offerings, or repeated your name enough to guide you through. Families did what they could, the poor offered bread, the wealthy gave land. All in hopes of shortening a stay in a place no one had seen but everyone dreaded. Fear, too, was part of the Church's influence. The Church provided answers when no one else could. It explained failed rains, children who didn't wake, why sickness struck the young but spared the wicked. It framed suffering as purposeful and obedience as rewarding. In a chaotic world, the structure it imposed, even when heavy and demanding, offered a kind of peace. Not always comfort, but a steady, reassuring order. You never questioned the Church's power. Not seriously. Not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the Church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all. And a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much. Even when the bishop demanded too many taxes. Even when the indulgent seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed or you acted like you did, which in the end was mostly the same because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring and the candles would burn. And your name would be said often enough to matter. The Church taught that your soul might not reach heaven immediately. It could linger in purgatory, a dim corridor between torment and salvation. You might remain there for years, centuries, or even longer, unless someone intervened. Unless family or friends prayed, lit candles, gave offerings, or repeated your name enough to guide you through. Families did what they could, the poor offered bread, the wealthy gave land. All in hopes of shortening a stay in a place no one had seen but everyone dreaded. Fear, too, was part of the Church's influence. The Church provided answers when no one else could. It explained failed rains, children who didn't wake, why sickness struck the young but spared the wicked. It framed suffering as purposeful and obedience as rewarding. In a chaotic world, the structure it imposed, even when heavy and demanding, offered a kind of peace. Not always comfort, but a steady, reassuring order. They prayed that the saints still heard them. They hoped their sins had been properly measured and forgiven. They wished that the Church, with all its weight, mystery, dust, and gold, would guide them through to the end. You might assume that after enduring famines, plagues, tithes, taxes, and the relentless control of the Lord, peasants would have risen up more often. That generations of suffering would have built until one day the frost melted and something inside them finally broke. That they would gather in fields and marketplaces, tools in hand, hearts burning, declaring they would kneel no more. But they rarely did. Not often, not fully, and never all together. There were revolts, like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, or the Jacquerie in France decades earlier. Small uprisings appeared across Europe, like pebbles disturbing a still pond. Angry voices flared in places where lords had demanded too much, pushed too hard, or taxed one coin too many. Occasionally, a spark ignited, but it was fleeting. A tax collector's home might be set ablaze. A steward could be driven from town. A banner might be raised in defiance. But those uprisings flared briefly and were extinguished even faster. They often ended with executions, gallows erected in village squares, the silence afterward heavier than before. Life didn't change. The grain still needed planting. To understand why peasants didn't rise more often, you have to stop seeing them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors, not of isolated disasters, but of relentless hardship, year after year. They lived in a world with low ceilings, where hope was measured out sparingly, like rations of grain. It wasn't courage they lacked. It was room to maneuver. In a life spent constantly repairing roofs and keeping soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion. You could plan a revolt or dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The reality was that the system endured not because it was fair, kind, or efficient, but because it was ancient. Its roots ran deep into generations' habits. It required no explanation, it simply existed. You owed labor. You owed a portion of your grain. You owed the church a tenth and the Lord his harvest. You owed a silent nod when the reeve walked past your home. You were born into this cycle of obligation, and unless fortune intervened, you died within it as well. Yet, by staying within these limits, survival was possible. Barely, perhaps, but possible. The cost of breaking the rules was far too great. The manor had its soldiers. The church had excommunication. The king may not have known your name, but his laws still bound you. Punishment for defiance wasn't always immediate death, sometimes it was worse, banishment, starvation, leaving your family to shoulder debts you tried to evade. Everyone had heard the stories, a father taken, a mother whipped, a cousin vanished for refusing to pay. These stories were shared not to inspire rebellion, but to discourage it. Besides, uprising rarely seemed like a real option because the people around you weren't strangers, they were family, neighbors, companions. You shared fields, tools, fences, and prayers. Even if you despised the steward, you might still marry his daughter. Even if you resented paying tithes, you still carried bread to mass. The village wasn't a place you could easily abandon, nor could you dismantle it without dismantling a part of yourself in the process. Revolting against the manor was, in a way, revolting against the rhythms of your own life. Looking back centuries later, it's tempting to see the peasant as a figure of endless submission. Head bowed, hat in hand, yet that image oversimplifies their lives. Submission wasn't mere servitude, it was a form of negotiation. Most peasants didn't just suffer, they adapted. They bartered, they bent the rules, and they found small loopholes to carve out some control. A pig hidden from the ledger, an extra sack of rye buried for later, a bribe paid in eggs instead of coin, these were the rebellions they could manage. They were practical people. Their lives weren't guided by ideology but by the weather. The question wasn't about fairness, it was about survival through winter. Justice, when it came, was a luxury they couldn't rely on. Lords changed, priests were replaced, rules shifted, but the wind still blew, the soil still needed tending, and children still cried from hunger. They didn't revolt against that. They endured. The church played its role too, often more effectively than any sword. It taught that suffering was noble, endurance virtuous, and that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You learned that your hardships weren't punishment, but a form of purification. Obedience promised reward, just not in this life. And if heaven's promise wasn't enough, the fear of hell filled the gaps, fire, torment, gnashing of teeth awaiting the proud, the defiant, the ones who refused. Yet the peasants were not entirely passive. Their resistance was quieter, subtler. They whispered about the stewards, sang cheeky songs about the Lord, laughed when the priest fumbled his sermon, and shared stories of better days and fairer men. They found dignity in small acts, a shared crust of bread, a timely silence, a field worked slightly against the rulebook. Their rebellion was in surviving, bending the system just enough to keep breathing. Not through acceptance, but through quiet endurance. Every so often, circumstances shifted. A lord died, and his heir proved kinder. A new bishop might cancel debts. A fierce storm could remind the powerful of their mortality. But such changes came from above, not from the peasants. Their role remained to wait, to endure, to pass down what little they had, and to teach their children when to stay silent and when to show courage. And still, there were dreams. Dreams of something different, even if not called revolution. Hopes that one day, their children might not bear the same weight. When no one came knocking with lists of taxes or soldiers, when your back didn't ache before 30, when you could sleep without fearing wolves, raids, or the cold, those dreams sustained you. You didn't expect them to come true, you only needed them to survive. What's truly remarkable is not how rarely peasants revolted, but how they preserved their culture, faith, and families under relentless pressure. They kept songs alive without writing them down, passed stories from one generation to the next, remembered which plants could heal, and taught each other how to pray, give birth, and lay the dead to rest. They built a legacy that outlasted kings and crusades, not through banners or battles, but through sheer persistence. That persistence was their quiet rebellion. When the Lord demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit their candles. When the world turned harsh, they huddled together, waiting for spring. The fields may have belonged to others, but the soil remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them like it would in later centuries with speeches and slogans, but a different kind of strength thrived in their endurance. To face hardship without being entirely hardened by it was its own defiance. To kneel not from weakness, but knowing you could rise again tomorrow, that too was resistance. And so they persisted quietly, without monuments or songs to honor them. Their endurance lived in the rhythm of the plow, the smoke curling from cottages at twilight, the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured through stories passed to children, who would carry them forward. History often overlooks them, folding their lives into footnotes beneath kings and conquests. Yet the peasants were the thread holding the tapestry together. Without them, there would have been no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies under banners. They helped build the world even when it was denied to them. They may not have toppled their lords, but they outlasted them, and perhaps that was its own form of revolution. Tonight, we turn away from the grand tales of castles and kings and step instead into the overlooked edges of history. This isn't the story that makes it into paintings or chronicles. It's the story of medieval peasants, the people who didn't wear crowns, ride war horses, or leave behind great legacies. They endured plagues, hunger, bitter cold, and endless labor. Their lives were marked not by glory, but by quiet survival, long days, short nights, and a strength most of us today would struggle to endure. If stories like this about ordinary lives in history interest you, feel free to like and subscribe. And share in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. It's always grounding to see people across the world connecting over the same forgotten story. So, settle in, and let's begin at the very edge of the map. Here lies a village without a name, or if it ever had one, time has erased it. It sits in a shallow valley, hidden away in the middle of nowhere. Too distant for roads, records, or the notice of kings. No map would ever mark it, even if you owned one, which you don't. For you, the world ends where the forest begins. The trees are vast, heavy, and ancient, moving slowly like something alive, tolerating your presence but never quite welcoming it. The fields spread out in uneven stretches of green and brown, worked to the point of exhaustion, then worked again the next day. Somewhere far to the north lies a river. You've never laid eyes on it, yet people speak of it in the same hushed way they talk about saints or legends. This is the place you were born, and it's where you'll die. Perhaps no more than 60 paces separate the two. The homes here are bent and weathered, shaped by too many winters pressing against them. Their walls are wattle and daub, mud, straw, and sticks twisted together, patched again and again with whatever scraps the storms haven't stolen. The roofs, made of sagging thatch, slump under their own weight, dripping in corners you can never quite fix. The village carries a familiar smell, damp wool, wood smoke, and earth. Beneath it all lingers the sour edge of livestock and the faint rot of things left too long in the rain. You hardly notice it anymore. To you, it is simply the smell of life here. The road leading in is barely a road at all, only a pair of muddy tracks carved by the slow grind of ox carts. Pools of rainwater gather there, buzzing with mosquitoes. No noble or traveler of importance has set foot on it for years, perhaps ever. Most days pass in silence. Sometimes a bell rings faintly from a distant chapel, its sound drifting on the wind. More often, time is kept by the sun's climb, the lengthening shadows across the fields, or the dull ache that grips your back long before noon. There are perhaps a dozen families in the village, just enough to gather together on feast days. Everyone knows each other, and everyone knows each other's troubles, though they're mostly ignored until they can't be anymore. The closest thing to an elder is a man called Tom, who once held a conversation with a wandering monk and now repeats it as proof of his wisdom. No one questions him. His hut is still standing, his goats still alive. That seems qualification enough for leadership here. Life isn't measured in precision. There are no records, no maps, no deeds, no written claims. Boundaries are remembered by landmarks, past the old elm or where the earth turns soft. When disputes rise, they fade just as quickly, with a brief argument, a shrug, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed hand to hand until the quarrel no longer matters. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. When a stranger does arrive, it's the talk of the village for weeks. Where have they come from? What do they want? Do they carry a curse? Do they smell faintly of salt air? The appearance of an outsider is equal parts fascinating and frightening. And no one here truly leaves. The thought of travel is more rumor than reality. You've heard of towns and cities, with stone buildings stacked 2 or even 3 stories high, but such places feel like fairy tales, alongside stories of talking beasts or women who transform into birds. You can't long for a world you've never seen. Around it all, the forest remains thick, silent, and watchful, hemming the village in like a living wall. The hills roll on endlessly, and the roads, when they exist at all, are remembered more for bandits and misfortune than for leading anywhere worth reaching. And even if you did set out toward those distant places, what then? You don't know their dialects. You have no coin to trade, no sense of their customs. You don't even know your own exact age. So, you stay. There is a kind of safety in the familiar. Even when it's harsh, even when the roof leaks, the well runs shallow, and the same thin stew has been simmering for 3 days. There's comfort in the predictable rhythm, in knowing where the firewood is stacked, who to call when a fence gives way, and which patch of the evening sky tells you it's time to bring in the sheep. Life is simple. You rise with the sun, work until it dips, and rest in the dark. It may not be much, but it is life. And within that quiet rhythm lies a kind of peace, a peace that never demands answers, never looks beyond what can be seen from the crest of the nearest hill. Occasionally, you'll hear a rumor, a war being fought, a king who has died, or a comet streaking across the heavens that frightened a village 5 days' walk away. But such news never arrives whole. By the time it reaches you, it's just a story, worn thin from passing through too many voices, a merchant, a shepherd's cousin, a distant traveler. Its urgency disappears long before it arrives. Even time itself feels different here. The seasons don't turn neatly. They slip and blur, fading into each other with no clear line between one and the next. A damp spring softens into a soggy summer. A sharp frost hardens into a winter that bites straight through your boots. You don't count the years the way others might, you measure life by the harvests. The dry one, the wet one. The bad one, when the rye turned black with rot. The good one, when the barley grew thick and plentiful, and even old Margery managed to smile for a week. Every so often, the steward comes. He asks questions, takes notes, and gathers grain for the Lord. You answer carefully, never saying too much. He doesn't care for detail. You've never seen the king himself, and you don't really know what he does. But you know his name, and you whisper it in your prayers, just in case it holds some weight in the heavens. Here, on the far edge of the map, very little ever changes. And when it does, change usually carries trouble. Still, the hearth glows. The roof mostly keeps out the rain. The cottage holds warmth through the cold. And tomorrow, the same sun will rise above the same hills. For now, that is enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, yet nearly all of them will be in circles. Most people in the medieval countryside never ventured more than a few miles from where they were born. Not because they lacked curiosity, strength, or endurance, though boots were rare luxuries, but because the world beyond the next hill didn't feel like it belonged to them. The thought of chasing it seemed as unlikely as learning to fly. You grew up memorizing the land between your cottage and the edge of the fields. You knew the twist of every tree root on the path to the well. You could recognize neighbors by the depth and shape of their footprints pressed into the muddy road. But anything past that was more rumor than reality. The next village might sit only 5 miles away, yet it could just as easily be a foreign land. You'd hear whispers about it, who married whom, who stole a goat, who swore the priest snored through mass. But you never saw it with your own eyes. And most likely, you never would. Travel was uncertain, often dangerous, and rarely worth the risk.